Welcome back to Never Enough Novels. Since it's Nonfiction November, I wanted to share a list of a few of my recommendations for the best narrative nonfiction that I've read or books that are on my TBR. Narrative nonfiction is a unique type of genre where they're telling the story about true events, but writing it in a way that feels like a novel. So these are fast-paced, like page-turning books that will give you all of the details about a certain event or a certain period in history, but it's told in a way that will just utterly captivate you. I'm not normally a huge nonfiction reader. I usually only read a couple each year, but pretty much every single book is narrative nonfiction because it feels sometimes like I'm reading a thriller. My all-time favorite narrative nonfiction book that I just read this year, and it might be one of my favorite books of 2024, is called Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen. This book tells the story of what would happen in a realistic scenario if the United States was attacked by a nuclear warhead. So Annie walks us through step by step what happens from the moment that the warhead is launched from another country up through the moment of impact to the devastating consequences that follow. It is clear that she spent an enormous amount of time conducting interviews and research with everyone from scientists that have worked in the nuclear program to top government officials, like all the way up to like the Secretary of Defense, that are sharing sometimes top secret information about what happens in the moments after the US realizes it's going to be attacked. This book is terrifying and fascinating because it shows how all of humanity, or like 80% of humanity, can be destroyed in mere hours after a scenario like this takes place. She also dives into a bit about the history of nuclear weapons from when they were first built and used, like in World War II, all the way up through where it currently stands as of 2024. I cannot stress how much I adored this book and also learned a lot, and I feel like it opened my eyes to the actual consequences of what would happen if our nuclear safeguards fail. Next up is a book that's probably number one on my nonfiction TBR, and that is called The Only Plane in the Sky. It's an oral history of what happened on 9/11. The writer, Garrett Graff, tells the story of how this day was actually lived by those who were involved or who had friends and family members that were there. He draws on conversations with over 500 people, from government officials to ticket agents to regular citizens, and uses a combination of never before published transcripts, declassified documents, and oral histories to tell the story about what it was like to be there and be a part of this historic event. I have heard from so many people that this is an incredibly moving and horribly sad book, but it's a really important understanding of what went down that day and what it was like from the people who actually lived it. This is a powerful tribute to the courage of everyday Americans and a chance to honor those who lost their lives by hearing about their stories. Next up are two recommendations by Michael Lewis. He is a nonfiction author who is amazing at taking complicated situations or events and breaking them down in a way that makes them much easier to understand. My first recommendation is Moneyball, which is a baseball-focused nonfiction book. Lewis explores how the second poorest team in baseball won an incredible number of games back in 2002. The Oakland Athletics lost their three most expensive players at the beginning of the season, but ended up winning an unprecedented number of games by the end. This was the first instance of using analytics in baseball to determine how to build a team and manage them in a way that would get them to win. The general manager looked beyond traditional baseball statistics and used numerical analysis to identify the best players that would form the best team. As a baseball fan, this was particularly interesting to me, but I also feel like it's just an interesting exploration of how statistics are now used in sports so often and kind of where that all started from. It's also definitely got the underdog story type narrative, since you're taking a team that has players that were not paid well or who'd been overlooked before, and they were given a second chance and a chance to become something greater than anyone ever imagined. And after I read Moneyball, I wanted to explore more of Lewis's collection, so the next book I took on that I highly recommend is The Big Short. This was his in-depth look at what happened during the 2008 financial crisis. And it was also made into an incredibly popular movie, which I also recommend. He also did a deep dive into the few individuals who understood what was happening with the crisis and bet against basically the economy and the stock market and ended up winning big. There was so much involved in this book as far as an understanding of what actually happened during that time period in our history, and it was a really helpful overview of understanding how it happened, like how we can prevent it in the future, and then also like how these few individuals went against everything that everyone was saying and made a big bet and won. My next recommendation deals with a topic that is still very valid today, and that is the opioid crisis. This one is called Dreamland. This recommendation actually comes from my husband because he's the one who read it as he was trying to understand more about what's happening with the opioid epidemic in our country and how it all started. Basically, it covers a widespread look at the history of the opioid crisis, how it started, like how it's ravaging towns throughout our country, and what our current status is. He said it was incredibly well researched and full of intriguing facts about the crisis that's facing our country. On a different note, my next recommendation takes us into space. This one is called Rocketmen by Robert Kurson. It follows the events of the Apollo 8 mission. So if you're at all interested in the history of our travel into space and you particularly love the Apollo missions, this book will be for you. As NASA was facing down a deadline from JFK, the Apollo 8 mission was a risky, too fast mission that took place around Christmas, and this book tells the history of what happened leading up to it and the events afterward. I highly recommend this for anyone who is interested in space or wants a more in-depth look at such a pivotal moment in the Apollo missions. Taking us back a little bit further in time, my next recommendation is Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. She is another author that I love for narrative nonfiction books. She also wrote Seabiscuit, which tells the story of the infamous racing horse, and I adore all of the books that I've read by her. But Unbroken is my top recommendation. She takes a tale that is already interesting and turns it into a story that you absolutely will not be able to put down. Louis Zamperini was an American Olympic runner who also enlisted and fought in World War II. He survived being lost at sea, multiple prisoner of war instances, and intense PTSD after he returned home. There are parts of this book that are undeniably extremely difficult to read, and there were times where it was hard to imagine one person actually going through all of these horrific events. But ultimately, this story is one of incredible resilience and hope. You will feel all of the emotions going through this one, but ultimately and incredibly, it ends with hope. My last recommendation is about a topic that I particularly love, which is the Titanic. I've always found that story to be fascinating, and I've consumed so many different documentaries and movies and books that focus on this. But one of my favorite books that feels the most comprehensive and intriguing is A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. In my opinion, no nonfiction book is as thorough and well researched as this one. And for that reason, it's widely considered the classic Titanic account and the one that most people rely on when they're looking for details about what happened. Walter Lord created a literal minute-by-minute reconstruction of what happened during the events leading up to the Titanic and the actual night that it sank. It was first published all the way back in 1955, so he was a lot closer to the timing of when it all happened, and I think that's why it still holds up as one of the greatest accounts and the most accurate published writings about what happened that night. And if you're at all interested in what happened on the Titanic, this will be an incredible book for you. Hope you found some new ideas about what you can read during Nonfiction November. If you have any other nonfiction books that you love, please share them in the comments for everyone else to get more recommendations during this month. And as always, make sure you hit like on this video and subscribe to see more of my book recommendations in the future.